These right here are just the books that I have on my desk currently because I'm writing a comparative Genocide book. Take a look at these titles. Go ahead. I've got half a dozen more on these shelves and several ebooks and audiobooks that I've listened to. Your point is false. I know this is long. Use double speed. I hope you listen to it all because you might change your mind. You might realize that you've been fed pro-Stalin communist propaganda. Being a communist is fine. But that's not what Stalin was. That's not what any communist country has actually achieved. The proof of my first book is actually on the way today, but let me read you a bit. And by the way, the point of, oh, that's just fash propaganda is exactly what communists say. And the other side says it too. Political ideology is not either you're a fash or you're a communist that ignores literally everything in between, but each side promotes that same propaganda and they lie about what they've done. Being a communist is fine because Marxism looks good on paper, even I think that, but it doesn't work. It's never been achieved, and I don't think it ever could be achieved because people are evil, and when everyone is supposed to be equal, that leaves room for a dictator to rise. But that and the fact that they perpetrated several ethnic cleansings and genocides will be argued by die-hard tankies. I don't know what's worse, if you never learned about it or if you learned about it and you choose to ignore it. Stalin ruled with an iron thumb, fist, and wall, and during his near 30-year reign, at least 14 million people were sent to a gulag, a work camp, and another 7 to 8 million people were exiled or deported. The best estimates that historians come up with based on the minimal and unreliable records, granted, because they did get rid of a lot of things, right? The best records are that at least 1 million people, but up to 1.7 million people in gulags. But it's likely much more than that because they're still unburying mass graves. A couple decades ago, they even unburied a tunnel that went through the Ural Mountains, and inside of the tunnel, there were a bunch of bodies. The Great Purge lasted from 1937 to 1939, but during the first year, 1.5 million political opponents, religious leaders, kulaks, I'll get to in a minute, and Red Army leadership were arrested, and roughly half, about 700,000 people, were. Not to even mention the numerous ethnic cleansing operations by the NKVD. One of the largest operations was the elimination of 111,000 Polish people. So kulaks were wealthy peasants. They could own about 8 acres of land or more, they could hire a farmhand if they really needed to, and they had more than 2 animals. That's what classified a kulak, and millions of them were ethnically cleansed from areas that the USSR invaded, occupied, and forced to become part of their republics. They targeted a specific minority on purpose. That is a genocide. Not to even mention the 2 intentional famines. During the famine of 1930 to 1933, which included Holodomor, which was in Ukraine, because this famine mainly affected Ukraine, they were intentionally starved out. 5.7 to 7 million people were starved out. And then because of collectivization, what was supposed to be super good and helpful, but really just ended up in starvation and forcing people, deporting them to a sea camp, right? Because they were kulaks and they owned land and didn't want to join the state-run operation. Anyways, from 1946 to 47, there was another famine due to collectivization. 1 to 1.5 million people were starved out. And to make it even better, the Soviet Union exported millions of pounds of grain during that famine. The grain that was grown in, say, the Caucasus could have gone to feed the people who were starved out in the Caucasus, but instead, the USSR exported all of that grain. About 15 million kulaks were deported to Siberia, the region that makes up most of Eastern Europe, and other Asian countries between 1917 and 1937. That was during Stalin's reign. 15 million people. And you know how he deported them? Cattle cars. Cattle cars. Yeah, and then the other people started using that idea. Also, the Soviets invented that the truck that they would put the exhaust in the back of the truck to gas people. Yeah, the Soviets invented that, and then the other people started using it too. In the satellite states, which were not considered part of the USSR's countries, at least 5.8 million ethnic minorities were forcibly displaced from their homes and deported to settlements within the USSR. So they would go to other countries and deport people and bring them back to Siberia. And just one example, but by far not the only, of a massacre, the Katyn massacre. It was an execution of about 22,000 captured members of the Polish officer corps on March 5th in 1940. A single day, 22,000 people. Oh my gosh, I'm like breaking out in an allergic reaction here. So not to even mention the anti-Semitic purges that the USSR completed. See, they were also super anti-Semitic. Even though the Bolsheviks had a lot of Jewish people in it originally, that was not who ruled. That was not the Stalinist communist party. If records are so shitty, which sometimes they are, how do we know this? Census data. You look at the census from before and after, and you see, well, how many people are missing, especially in the countries that they occupied and then deported people from. The backspacing of 20 million lives can be directly attributed to Stalin's policies. And due to Soviet colonization, because that's what it is, people began doing the same exact thing in other countries. Like China, they did the same exact things, including the forced starvation. Vietnam, Cambodia, North Korea. Does any of that ring a bell? You cannot deny the genocide in Cambodia or North Korea. I know that people don't want to classify it as such, but it is. So I'm writing my second book, but I think my third book, if it's not going to be about pals, it's going to be about how Stalin and Mustache compare. I might call it a tale of two mustaches because they were basically brothers.